Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots of Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Shutt, here today. So lucky to have Erin Underwood with us today to talk all about, her journey and domain-specific generative AI. Erin, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really
Absolutely.
excited.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. So if you don't mind, would you tell us a little bit about, yourself, your background, your journey and how you became an executive in a AI startup?
Yeah, for sure. So my journey in the technology world is not really direct.
Hmm.
So I started off as really started in high school when I did a science experiment for the science fair and I redesigned parts of the Mars landing apparatus. And that sort of began my journey into really enjoying designing things.
Hmm.
Um, from there, I went to USC. I started off as an astronautical engineer for 2.5 years, found out I can computer program to save my life in Fortran 90 at least.
Hmm.
And then I switched to international relations and Arabic. So I have a really interesting background where, I really use totally different parts of my brain. And really, like, in my opinion, like my biggest strength is like fitting things together,
Hmm.
and fitting patterns together. So I graduated college. I went through ROTC.
Hmm.
I got a rated slot out in the Air Force, which meant I was going directly into a flying program. I trained with the Navy for 2.5 years, or 2 years, as a weapons systems officer. And then I went into fighter fundamentals training, and then I went into my platform, it's right behind me, the F-15E.
Hmm.
So I flew for a total of 6.5 years in the Air Force, which was phenomenal. It was one of the hardest things, probably the hardest thing I've ever done was fighter training. But it's very rewarding. The people around you are phenomenal. It's really cream of the crop type of people. So it was very challenging, but it was also super fun. Um, and then I blew my ear out in Afghanistan. And when I say blew, I cracked the bone in my inner ear. I finished my deployment, still flying, until basically flew until I broke, towards the end of deployment. And then
Hmm.
went through a really long medical journey of figuring out what was going on.
Hmm.
And I finally got diagnosed that I have a thing called superior canal dehiscence.
Hmm.
And so I had to retrain in the Air Force. So I retrained as Office of Special Investigations agent. And
Hmm.
within that, I specialized in counterintelligence, and then I specialized in counterintelligence again. So I did that for about 5.5 years. And then I finally got medically retired. The Air Force realized, like, oh, everything you have going on with this
Hmm.
here, it's totally medically disqualifying from the military.
Hmm.
So I retired as a major in Hawaii, and then I got picked up at SAIC to help stand up a consultancy inside of the organization.
Hmm.
Because I had done some organizational management consulting between that time of getting out and then getting hired by SAIC. And from there, they quickly abandoned that idea after about 2 to 3 months. And then my team and I found ourselves leading a software development of a product that we were selling internally and externally, which is how I found myself as an accidental product owner,
Hmm.
for working with Scrum teams on the regular and helping build a customer success team for this inside of SAIC. So it's really kind of how I landed inside of the software development world
Hmm.
totally by accident.
Hmm.
Again, couldn't program in Fortran 90 to save my life.
Right.
Uh, uh, so in that, I met, I hired a company called NN Data to help with a problem set revolving around satellites that we were trying to solve for the Air Force. And when I hired Data on as a sub, I ended up working with someone named Stephen Aberly, and we worked pretty closely together for about 3 to 4 months, helping solve this problem with both of our teams. And I didn't really think much of it. He was a great guy. Like, we got along really well together, but we didn't, work super closely for that long. And then I left SAIC to go back as a DoD contractor to stand up a small counterintelligence unit inside of Indo-PACOM.
Mhm,
Um, and I did that for a while, had a great time, really phenomenal problem set, the Indo-Pacific. And we did a lot of really good work. I did leave that to go for some other reasons to go back into the software development world where I quickly got a phone call very shortly after leaving my
mhm,
one job at Indo-PACOM for another about a month after I arrived. I had been in this
mhm,
position. Stephen gave me a call and I was like, did you start your own company?
mhm,
And I told him, I'd love to get a demo. He was working on this generative AI thing. This was back in 2022.
mhm,
And so ChatGPT hadn't come out. Like no one knew what was really, anything about generative AI except those that had been researching it. And um, so I get this phone call and I ask for a demo and I'm immediately thinking like, I'm going to tell this guy like 18 different names of like
mhm,
companies and commands and like people inside of those to
mhm.
get this to. So what ended up turning from a demo, it ended up turning into a job pitch.
I mean,
And so, yeah, so so that's how I found myself here. I did leave after a few months. I wanted to make sure that the program that I was helping stand up for my last company was in better shape and could easily be transitioned with the embedded teams before
mhm.
I left for now at the company I'm at called Rohirrim.
It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah,
Thank
pretty
you.
circuitous journey.
Thank you for your service and thank you for
Yeah,
all you
thanks.
do. That's really, really cool. You're the first fighter pilot we've had on the podcast, and I'm really
Cool,
excited to have
cool.
yeah, absolutely. So how did thinking about like a lot of obviously having just a winding journey, what are some of the skills you picked up along the way that you think have been, the most that have been, lend to your success, as in this small business startup world?
Yeah. I would say the biggest one is, particularly as it pertains to startups, is grit and perseverance. And
Mhm.
that is not something that people are just gifted. It's
Yeah.
something you earn through the blood, sweat, and tears of
Yeah.
doing really hard things over and over and over again. The other thing that I would say is adaptability. You really need both of those things when you are when you are in the startup, whether it's and particularly when you're in a high growth, early stage
Mhm.
startup. So I came on as employee number 7,
Mhm.
and we were pre-Series A funding, and we were also in stealth, but we actually had like about 12 customers in our platform before we ever came out of stealth, and it was all through word of mouth.
It's amazing.
Um, yeah, from one customer to the other. And so we were learning quite a bit about how people are using the platform, how people are, interacting with generative AI, because it was still really new at that point. The reason we came out of stealth was because ChatGPT became publicly available.
Mhm.
And we realized we need to quickly come out of stealth sooner than we had planned because now people are actually gaining awareness of what this capability has to offer and how this capability could be used, which was a great time. But you're not only think about like not only launching a product, but you also need to completely educate a market.
Mhm.
So with that, like growing a small company into a larger company, when I joined, like I said, I was employee number 7 when I joined. We now have 44 employees, and almost a year and a half later.
Mhm.
So we have quadrupled in size in a year and a half. In a year, this time last year we had 11
Wow.
employees.
Mhm.
Yeah, so if you just think about just not only in terms of the tech and evolving with your customers,
Mhm.
but just evolving as an organization, there's a lot of growing pains that come along with that. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of communication that needs to happen. And you have to kind of guide people through that journey if they've never done it before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I love, perseverance and grit, as somebody who is an entrepreneur and has a couple of businesses and,
Yeah.
yeah,
You know then,
oh,
yeah.
I 100% know, and I know, and, like, it always cracks me up whenever I'm talking to, like, folks that are a little younger, and they're like, "I wanna start a business for, like,
You're
to
like,
make money and
careful
for the
what you ask
lifestyle."
for.
Right, it's like, "No, you don't understand. People
Right.
don't understand what goes into this, whether it's
Oh,
a
yeah.
high-growth startup or, like, mental health or on the gov cons whatever, like, it's ultimately, it's all on you.
Yep.
You're making decisions
Yep.
because people below you can't, and they,
Right.
it's and like you get the hard calls. You're the one that makes the decisions about who to hire, who to fire,
Yeah.
what to do, and
Yeah.
that directly impacts your bottom line. I've made mistakes that have cost me a lot of money,
Yeah. Yeah.
and a lot of time, and time is just invaluable. And so it's like, you think like people don't really understand. I mean, I've never worked in like a super high growth startup like that. Um, but I'd imagine it's very similar to all the other ones that I've done.
Yeah.
It's
You're
it's
laying it on the line, right? Like this isn't just like, oh, it's one thing to work at a large company.
Mhm,
And it's another thing to not just work at a startup, but also help build, either build it yourself or be part of that core building team.
mhm,
You're putting like it is life. It is life. Like talk
mhm,
about like work-life balance. Like you don't really get that choice when you're building your own company.
mhm,
It just because you're fully invested.
mhm,
This is a high stakes game that I think you're right. I think a lot of people love the idea of being the CEO, making all the decisions, and being in charge. But what a lot of people, like you, to your point, a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of really hard, really ugly decisions that get made in the background. Like
yep,
because you're dealing not only with your livelihood as someone who's helping or is building the company, but you are in charge of everyone, all of your employees' livelihoods as
mhm,
well. And
yep,
there are sometimes you have to make some really tough calls.
100%. You're also the last person to get paid,
For
period, bottom
sure.
line,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's
Yeah.
that too, is that,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, sometimes there's a lot of money left over after you pay bills, and sometimes
Yeah.
there's just not, right? And
Right.
it's, and you're also the one that has to sit there and understand that, like, if I don't close this customer or if I don't close this client, if I don't get money in, then
Yeah.
I have to make decisions, and it's all on you, right? And so,
Yeah.
it's fascinating from you're absolutely right though. Perseverance and adaptability, I think, are great, and then just I've always felt also found delivery, and like
Yeah.
being able to deliver really, really difficult or not clear tasks, or like
Yeah.
go and like make order out of the chaos and understand, like prioritize
Oh
and then
yeah.
just execute, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easy when somebody tells you, all right, you need to go do that, whatever, gives you orders to go do something. But when you're sitting at the top and figuring out how it's all going to get divvied up and how it's going to, I mean, that's just a different conversation
Yeah.
altogether, right?
Totally. Yeah, and I love how you said, bringing order to chaos. That's actually a huge, litmus test for us when we're interviewing to make sure that we have the right people, is if bringing order into chaos does not excite you, if it
Mhm,
terrifies you, then the stage of company that, like, we're post Series A, like,
mhm,
we're 44, we've got, a really great amount of revenue for our size of company and stage of
mhm,
company. Um, but there's still a lot of chaos that you're built as you're building and you're rapidly growing. The direct byproduct of that
mhm.
is some chaos. And if that doesn't excite you, then this isn't the right spot for you.
Right. Go
Yeah.
go go work at a larger company where your job
Right.
is stable. You know
Yes.
what you're doing every day.
Yeah. The
But like,
processes are built.
right. Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
what's the process? I'm rebuilding constantly and changing them constantly,
Right.
because like one of my favorite things is that if you don't know why you do something a certain way, like you need to go back in and re-examine it. Like that's
Yeah.
100, like unless there's a good reason why, like, and because we've always done it this way is not a good one.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, or that's the easiest way it was to build at the time,
Mhm.
but now we're at a different point in time, so yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
100%. And so can you, we've talked a little bit about Rohirrim. Can you tell everybody like what you guys
Yeah.
do, your specialty, and also why you're, I know that there's been some other folks that have come into the space, why you guys are different, and why you're, in your opinion, I would assume the best out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So our company is called Rohirrim. We are a generative AI company specifically built for purpose built applications for organizations.
Hmm.
So you can really think of is there's a set of very generic generative AI tools out there that are just for building any content,
Hmm.
and there are some free tools available that are truly democratized generative AI, where the information set that they've been trained on is also very open and
Hmm.
democratized, right? And so what we do is we actually build specific applications for specific custom purposes
Hmm.
that also harnesses organization or agencies or companies data within
Hmm.
that, because what we realize with sort of these open models like ChatGPT and Bard, is that they're great for starting really generic specific, like a starting place, or getting like, things like a workout program, or like come up with a recipe, or
Hmm.
write something like a pirate, or a great, like, give me a generic outline that I can then build off of.
Hmm.
But when you're dealing with company or even like government data, all of that's proprietary and it's sensitive. And when you input, so we used to call like priming the pump, quote unquote, where you would feed your specific content into those open models in
Hmm.
order to make it more specific, your answer more specific. You're actually giving away your data to feed fed and trained into that model. And a lot of companies, a few of them, this really bit them in the behind, where they actually gave away copyrighted propriety,
Wow.
intellectual property, and
Mhm.
then the model actually spit that back out, which is why you saw after about, I think it was about the, like, maybe the 5 or 6 month mark, a lot of companies were blacklisting OpenAI, ChatGPT on their corporate domain
Mhm.
networks because of that.
Yeah.
Um, so what we do instead is we realize, like, well, this could be wildly beneficial for companies, particularly as it pertains to knowledge management and knowledge sharing
Mhm.
across an organization, if you close everything within a boundary. And so
Mhm.
that information isn't going out into an open model, but instead you can still interact with your data the way that you would a human being with natural language, rather than coming up with some wild Boolean search query that every Intel analyst has ever done
Right.
to find anything.
Mhm.
So, or if you're like scouring SharePoint folders for hours, you can save a ton of time if you know two things. One, that your information's secure, it's not going out into an open model. And two, if you can actually find where that answer is coming from, rather
Mhm.
than just it not being across the internet, and you kind of have to trust but verify on the back end, or just
Mhm.
blindly trust.
Right.
So if you know those two things, you really get a lot more value out of the responses that you're getting out of generative AI. So that's what our company specializes in. And then we hold the patent for effectively marrying organizational data in a very specific way with a workflow as it pertains to responding to government, but also commercial requests for proposals. So RFPs, requests for information, RFIs, the things that are actually driving that revenue, like your revenue and growth, in order to win more work. So
Mhm.
that's where our product is called Rohan. It's our platform. And our first product is called Rohan RFP, which is for companies that are specifically responding to government and or other company RFPs. We use it as well on ourselves. A lot of companies now are giving us RFPs to respond to,
Wow.
which is like, oh, great, this is exactly what our
Mhm.
tool's for.
Right.
And then our second product is Rohan Procure, which is exactly the flip side of that. So the government has approached us, a few agencies have approached us, and we've responded to some BAAs and RFPs for agencies that have asked us to how do we use generative AI to actually make the RFP, and also help have a neutral evaluation, rather than like someone on like they have a personal relationship and they're reviewing the proposal responses.
Mhm.
So because if you think actually like responding to the RFP is hard. Creating one from all of those requirements is really difficult. And then coming up with all of the make sure you have all the right contract language. Also, if you've ever read a government RFP before, they're usually wildly contradictory in what they're asking, usually really vague,
Mhm.
and their instructions are super unclear. And they know that. And
Yeah.
so the government is actually asking, like, how do we tackle this really hard problem so we actually get like higher quality proposal
Mhm.
responses. And then on the backside, you write like a 300-page RFP and you're one company, they have hundreds of those to
Right.
go through. And
Mhm.
it months, and you're supposed to get feedback, but they don't have time to actually give that. So they know the process needs uh,
Mhm.
innovation
Yeah.
attached to it. So that's what our company does. And the reason why I think we're why I would say they're the best. Number one, we're I think we're the oldest platform out there in terms of maturity. There's there might be one other one where we had a really similar timeline journey called AutoGen. But their RFP practice is predominantly in the UK, and ours is in the US, where we're really attaching the CMMC security guidelines, all of the NIST guideline, like those 300 plus controls over our data and within the platform boundary itself. The other thing is the other main differentiator I say is, one, is we have patented technology,
Mhm.
and two is our security is just top notch. We make sure, because so many of us on the leadership team came from the SAP community, especially the in the DoD, the military, the IC, all in specialized special access programs. We really brought that in when we started creating the platform from the ground up. Security was always at the first and foremost at our minds.
Absolutely. No, them and I thank you for that explanation. And I know that the emphasis on security is I mean super key, but also,
Yeah,
especially with when you're dealing with the information that you're dealing with, where you have companies that are, that are trusting you with all of their proposal documents and
right.
all of that proprietary information that they've built up, right? And then I would assume the same thing on the government side. That's also
Correct.
super key.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where, I mean, obviously depending on the agency, but some of them like obvious, it's
All on the some of them are only on the high side,
Mhm.
where they really want the deployment to happen. And I
Right.
mean, that's obviously like a much longer term
Mhm.
deployment, but that's
Mhm.
that's the direction we're heading. Yeah.
That's fantastic. No, and I mean, like, I think you're 100% right that, and I think you're in the right space where it's absolutely this process needs modernization, right? It
Yeah.
needs to be, kind of to what we were saying before, like they've been doing it this way for so long. But then I think also like from what I've read, a lot of contracting officers have been leaving, and
Yeah.
a lot of folks retired through COVID. And
Yeah.
then, you're sitting with this brain drain and you see it, a lot of the small business folks that I talk to in the federal space have been saying that like a lot of the projects for small business are getting larger because they're
Yeah.
trying to and they're merging projects together because they're looking to reduce the work, the strain on their
Yeah.
procurement staff because
Yeah.
there's just so much. So something like this sounds like it'd be really, really needed.
Oh yeah, and we see it on both sides of the aisle. Like you see it from the government side, where you're right, there is that it's a high burnout,
Mhm.
because these are huge, 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 huge projects to really generate these requests for proposals and actually make sure that that happens on timeline.
Mhm.
And then secondarily, on the other side, the actual proposal writers and managers and the BD capture folks, like that, we're seeing a ton of burnout on them as well, because they're responding to one after another, after another, after another.
Mhm.
And like I said, they're not always written most of the time. They're not written very well,
Mhm.
or they're contradictory in the way that they're written. And it's a lot to try to keep track of as a proposal writer and manager,
Mhm.
because not all, and especially if you're at a larger company, or if you're in an ever expanding company that's like buying up other companies, you have to
Mhm.
keep track of what are we doing now? What's the latest, model that we're using for hybrid cloud and multi-cloud transfer, digital transformation? And there's a lot to keep track of. And then I was on the my foray into proposals was I accidentally responded to
Mhm.
an email too fast about
Okay.
this data thing we were working on. And then I became the person to like review and write all the data sections. Like, I
Right.
didn't sign up for
Mhm.
this.
Yeah.
So but it's because on the proposal writers and managers are trying their best to like get the right information from SMEs, but then they wait on the SMEs, and the
Mhm.
SMEs are instead like they really want to be putting their time towards billable hours instead
Right.
of G&A hours.
Mhm.
So it's a really expensive, really time consuming process that something like generative AI, what we've seen is companies can expect to see anywhere from like 2,000 to 4,000% efficiency gain. And
Right.
that helps with things like burnout. It helps with
Mhm.
things like increasing your growth, like actually increasing the number of proposals you can get out the door and
Mhm.
decreasing the amount of time that it takes to just get the right information. So you're
Mhm.
not waiting on SMEs. If your data is connected
Mhm.
into a large language model and you're actually able to segment across your data,
Mhm.
the way that we ingest is really specific in that we will segment out data sets into particular sections so that you
Mhm.
can actually drill down into the right information, and we can implement role-based access control over that, which is another key security
Mhm.
feature that I haven't seen out there. It's really difficult to do with generative AI. Um,
Sure.
so, but when you do that, you're actually able to, like, I hear from companies, and I don't believe the statistic. I know the statistics, but then when I
Mhm.
hear a company, like a customer, like relay something back to me, as an example, like someone from IBM let us know, like what would have taken like a SME, 6 hours, a team of 6 hours
Mhm.
find and read through the right information to get the right answer to a proposal writer or manager. It
Mhm.
takes them one person 6 minutes.
It's crazy. That's
From
wild.
Yeah, or sorry, it's not 6 hours, 6 days.
6
6
days
days to six
to
minutes.
6
Like, that
minutes.
is absolutely absurd. Because if you
It's
think about
absurd.
it, what we have the ability to do is we connect your data in a way where it not only takes you, you ask a question,
Mhm.
it doesn't just it gives you an answer and it cites all of its information, but you should
Mhm.
actually like click on the links to actually go to the document on the exact page of that document to
Mhm.
verify. So can
So
you imagine not having to read through a 150-page document, like a keyword
Mhm.
search, and they got to open it,
Oh,
and then you
yeah.
got to find control F your way through
Mhm.
it, actually
Mhm.
find like, okay, what's the answer I am looking for? Instead of just you could click a link and you go directly to the
That's amazing.
source where you're like, yeah, that's what I was looking at. So that's why you can go, apparently took IBM 6 days now only takes 6 minutes. And we hear that from tons of customers, like what getting to a first draft takes,
Yeah.
what would have taken a team of five, you know, a week to do. It takes them 2 hours,
Mhm.
a
Absolutely.
team of two.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah,
wild. I don't know.
it's insane, and I was at an event last week. I think it was last week. I don't know. Time has no meaning anymore. But
Yeah.
it's like I like last week, and I was out. I was listening, and they were talking a lot about AI, generative AI specifically, and um, not like they were talking about the productivity gap that's been measured
Yeah.
in employees, those that use AI versus those that don't to do their job, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean, it 30 to 40% more productive if you utilize
Yeah.
AI to do your job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I use ChatGPT all the time. And like that's like I don't need anything as specific as what you guys are building, but like a lot of the stuff like, write me a social media post on
Right.
whatever.
Right.
And then it gives you something, you get past that blank page syndrome and
Yep.
you're actually able to think, what do I want to say? How do I manage this? How do we go about um, you know, wordsmithing it a little bit and then keep it moving, right?
Yeah.
A lot of things it's so easy and
Yeah.
it allows like I think when you're in the small business world and you're doing stuff like your most valuable resource you have on a daily basis is your brain power and your attention,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And like it allows me to actually focus on stuff that I need to focus on
Right.
and do the high value things that frankly, that I'm the one that has to do, as opposed to, drilling way down in a document and trying to read it for,
Yeah, exactly. And I love that you said like that, those high value tasks, because
Mhm,
that's what it's the lower value tasks of like finding and just,
mhm,
word vomiting words on paper so you can then, you're going to edit them either
mhm,
way. But
right.
if everyone loves editing rather than having to
Mhm,
create and generate sentences, it's so much easier if
mhm,
you have a starting point. And that's what we really focused on is also what you said is like, you use things like ChatGPT, but you always go back and edit. And that's what one thing that we are huge on is really creating applications that are really human factors
mhm,
focused by keeping the human in the loop
mhm,
continuously though. So,
right.
anybody that tells you like use this and like just it'll write it for you and submit it or,
Mhm,
post it, like don't do that.
yeah.
Everybody can tell when something's written by generative AI more or less at this point.
Mhm,
Um so we that's one thing we really 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 teach is like this isn't a final draft. It's your first draft. And
mhm,
now you get to spend instead of where you're spending 80% of your time finding information and
mhm,
then getting the words on paper, now you're spending 10 to 20% of your time doing that. You're spending 80% of your time actually creating a really high quality document where you're
mhm.
fine tune editing. You are, making sure that you've got wind themes written in there in the right spots. So that more high order thinking rather than that low order thinking, like you're saying, of just finding and reading to see if the information is even correct.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean that's fantastic. And I mean how do you build like how do you build trust in
Yeah,
systems like this, right? And how do you I mean I know you mentioned like, you have transparency from where the data comes in,
right,
right? But how
right.
do you build trust, and also how do
Oh,
you
really good.
build trust from a not just from the like in the system, but like how do you build trust in the user base, understand,
Yeah.
is that different, and how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that we're continuing to learn from because again, generative AI is really new. So like where we started from last year to where we are this year, very different in terms of even educating the market. So like last year when we were when we would do demos, like people were just kind of blown away that any piece of technology could generate brand new content.
Hmm.
No one had really seen it before. It felt like magic.
Yeah.
Well, since generative AI has been available to the populace for over a year now, we're seeing a lot more users that come in that are more educated, a lot more educated, and are asking a lot smarter questions around the use of generative AI. And the number one thing that we have found is that any everybody uses ChatGPT for something. It's usually something in their personal lives. But when it comes to really specific task specific content, you
Hmm.
really need a task specific application. And in
Hmm.
order to do that, you have to study how a user, one, goes through their first workflow, and then you have to find the suitable parts and pieces of that workflow that generative AI can tackle really well and which ones they can't. And what we do is we map that workflow out for our customers in the very beginning of the training process.
Hmm.
We tell them, here's where you're using it in the very beginning, here's where you're using it in the middle, here's where you're using it in the end. And
Hmm.
then from there, so in terms of like user understanding, that's really one thing is like, you really have to know where generative AI is suitable and where it's not incredibly suitable. So in order to do that, you also need to understand the limitations of generative AI.
Hmm.
Um, and so like one thing, everybody wants generative AI to come up with like with the new idea
Hmm.
of, give me something brand new, which it can give you brand new content words, but
Hmm.
generative AI is built off of past information. So it's
Right.
always pulling from a data set.
Hmm.
Uh, this is one thing that like we're starting to really I saw this when I was like helping Ditra work through their AI ethics
Hmm.
and guidelines and regulations was anytime you mention artificial intelligence, it's like you get the magic wand out and someone's like, just sprinkle some AI on it and it'll do the thing. Like, I think you guys don't understand that like AI starts off as like a really overeager intern, like knows many things, read a ton of stuff, but it like you ask it a question, it's just kind of like tell you everything that it knows
Right.
until you as a user really start understanding, okay, how do I interact with this in a really specific way? And that's something that I think users in general they're a lot better at. We're all better at what's called prompt engineering
Mhm.
now than we were this time last year. But it is still, we've been in keyword search for the last 20 years. So it's
Mhm.
still a new skill that everybody is learning.
Mhm.
So I think number one, those two things. Number two, it's baby steps, honestly.
Mhm.
Things like, we teach everyone on the front end of the very first application we teach our users on is this thing called Answer Engine. And it
Mhm.
truly is like a knowledge management type system where you ask it a question, it gives you an answer, it shows you exactly where the data is coming from. That exactly where the data is coming from is a huge trust builder
Mhm.
for our users.
Yeah.
And just the getting to that place where they're realizing, okay, I know how to interact with this now. I trust the information that I've been verifying it. I trust the information that it's giving me. Now I'm ready to move on to the next task specific area of the workflow, was actually using this to respond to a proposal.
Mhm.
When we get into our solutions architect and our proposal writer, really like walking you through like, okay, you have an RFP, input this, upload it. It's going
Mhm.
to give you, X, Y, and Z, and then you're crafting your responses
Mhm.
to. We see a really good, again, even though it's an intuitive tool, it's just that intuition of how we use it takes users it takes users maybe about a month or two to get really comfortable with that proposal writer tool,
Mhm.
because generative AI is so new. You have to use it in really specific ways.
Mhm.
So, and we are continuing to evolve our platform based off of user experience and user feedback. With something we take huge amounts of we take very seriously. We take huge amounts of pride in that we are always listening to our users. We
Mhm.
are always eliciting feedback, and we are continuously changing the roadmap on our platform to adapt
Mhm.
more specifically to their workflows. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so, one thing that you touched on that you mentioned is like, looking at what a generative AI is really good at and what it's not
Yeah.
good at. So, and you're, obviously, what do you think some of the best things? What do you think there's some things that it's really good at, and what do you
Yeah.
think things that like it's not good at, and what where some, when should you not be using AI?
Right. Really good, really, really good question. So number one, if you're using generative AI to generate content based off of what you've done, what you've been doing, here's the solutions that you bring to bear. If you're using it for, like in the medical community, if you're using it for things like use it to record in a doctor's, a doctor patient meeting, or session, then, and it's using that and it's summarizing it, it's taking away like, here's the next steps, here are the
Mhm.
action items, here are the drugs used. But it's all, number one, it's always trust but verify.
Mhm.
All artificial intelligence is trust but verify.
Mhm.
So in those regards, like, you can use it for those really, where it's the content is readily available. Like
Mhm.
it's either things that are happening right now that it's then using, or it's things that have happened as a store of information of things that have happened in the past. Where
Mhm.
generative AI is right now is it's not great at, like, you know, forecasting brand new solutions, because again, it's built off of it's really a predictive model on steroids. Like,
Mhm.
all it's doing is trying to find the next best word mathematically.
Mhm.
um, and it's been trained super well to do that, but it's not coming up with, well, here's your brand new, you're trying to accomplish this. Of
Mhm.
course, it can ideate, provide some ideation, quote
Mhm.
unquote, but it's not reasoning per se, the way
Mhm.
that a human being can. It's not going to spit the answer, to cold fusion to you.
Mhm.
Those are innovative things that humans are phenomenal at. That's a higher order thinking. I
Mhm.
think also, the more risky the use case, the less we should be relying on artificial intelligence. Like,
Mhm.
as writing words on a page, usually not that risky unless you're really like it's a very high sensitive like op word
Mhm.
or a task like that you're trying to accomplish. In those cases, yes, some things might be well suited for just pulling normal content, like this is
Mhm.
like sort of more boilerplate information. But when it comes down to the really task specific things at a very high risk environment or a high risk scenario, those are the things where you can use generative AI, but number one, it better be domain specific.
Mhm.
It better, and you better be able to verify each and every piece of that information that the artificial intelligence is pulling from.
Mhm.
Because the verification on the back end is going to need to be, to the nth degree. So
Mhm.
that's where I would say it really depends on some things that there are a lot of things that it is suitable for, but it's not always appropriate
Mhm.
necessarily to use. And I would say it's more for, like things like military campaigns and, or military operations
Mhm.
where you can use it for some things, but I certainly wouldn't use it for a lot of things just
Right.
because the risk is so high.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I like what you said around risk because I've seen a lot of companies. I mean, you and I have talked. I'm also in the mental health space, and I've seen some companies pop up trying to like advertise that they're starting a AI therapist or a generative AI therapist, and like that is just inherently terrifying for a lot of reasons. One is like first, I mean, God forbid you get hacked. Like, do you really want all
Right.
that out there? And
Right.
second, like invariably, what I imagine is like imagine this thing is up and running. Somebody is going to do something. It's going to be
Yeah.
something crazy,
Yeah.
whether it's hurt somebody, hurt themselves, whatever. And when they're asked why, oh, the AI told me to do it. My therapist told me to do it, or
Right.
something like that. And like that's just terrifying, right? It's just
Yeah.
terrifying that,
Yeah.
and like I don't even know how that would be HIPAA compliant, right? When you start, I
Right.
think, but taking that aside, things like that is terrifying. I think, I mean, there's also like these AI friends and AI significant others that they have been popping up, which is just, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, y'all need to go outside, but
I know, right? In some regards, like it should AI should be freeing us up to do those tasks
hmm
more of like the human to human interaction. Like
right.
you don't need to spend hours weeding through information anymore, or just getting your outline on a
hmm
page. Um, it should be more freeing us up for we're social animals, and it
hmm
should absolutely be. Yeah, that sounds terrifying to me, to have an AI therapist.
hmm
That's why people are highly skilled and highly trained. And there some instances where maybe an AI assistant could be
hmm
assistive to the therapist, of based off of this speech pattern or based off of the sentiment analysis, this is what I'm hearing from this person. And then
hmm
the mental health provider can say yes or no, or
right.
yes, but, or
hmm
yes, and
hmm
because I think we do see, in the medical community, like where, radiologists, like everybody thought that they were going to get replaced by AI. And instead, like they've gone, their jobs have skyrocketed because
hmm
it's been AI assistive though, and they're able to do, instead of just, find like, is this a tumor, is this benign, is this
right.
malignant, they're able to use their time doing different modalities than just looking at an image and finding the anomalies,
Right.
or seeing that it's normal.
Mhm.
So I think things like that, where it's where AI lends itself to be an assistant, that's where it's really, really, it can be really, really powerful, because it frees up your time to actually do, like you were talking about, those higher order
Mhm.
thought
Right.
tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like AI assistants, things like that are great. Some of the use cases I've seen
Yeah,
around, the healthcare space are like writing notes, right? Or
yeah,
taking your little scribbles and
exactly.
turning that
Yeah,
into like
yeah,
a actually, a coherent note. Like that's
yeah,
great, but I think it's way too early for anything like more treatment related.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean that's and 'cause you're 100% right. It's like it should be freeing up our time. We should
right.
have more time to do stuff, and that I think speaks to the productivity gap that I
Yeah,
mentioned earlier, and your product, the productivity that your product helps people. It allows you to do the stuff that you should be doing, not like research, right? Unless,
exactly.
I mean, unless that's your jam,
Yeah.
but yeah, so like when you start thinking about like the government and government space, how do you think AI is going to transform a lot of these spaces, broadly, but then also as it relates to procurement more specifically?
Yeah, I think that well, number one, I think we're gonna see a marrying of the requirements coming into the act, those systems are, well, one, they're kind of janky. Like
Mhm,
particularly for in the DoD, like the requirement system isn't the greatest. We've heard that across the board. It's very
mhm,
clunky. I think we're gonna see a transformation in those systems the where the requirement, and I think you're going to see a marriage of like multi-system. So like when it comes for policies are going to be fed in, and you're going to have the requirements, and then you're going to have the actual RFP come in. So I think that you're going to see marriage across systems, maybe across information sets,
mhm,
because having all of those things available into a domain where it's enclosed, but where a system can actually say, well, this piece of information actually contradicts this other piece of
mhm,
information you have. So number one, I think you're going to see it come across different information sets where they're actually going to be married together, particularly if you can, implement things like role-based access over those, like a lot of IC community systems have over them in terms of like, what you're allowed to see and not see. Um, I think I would love to see this across the intelligence community. That was the first thought that I had was, I watched the Intel analysts that I work with just come up with the craziest Boolean search queries
mhm,
across multiple IC community databases, and it was just painful. And they would not always get the right information, or you always worry about, is this am I getting all the information out there? Am I getting superfluous information that really doesn't mean anything? So I think you're going to see it built across those. The only thing I would say across, again, risk goes up.
mhm,
But I think the more that you have that connected into a system, particularly one that you can verify,
mhm,
um, I think that that would be a huge benefit across the Intel community. I think you're also going to see it across the policy communities as well, because everyone, like, there's so many policies out there that are written semi-contradictory, or even if they don't know that they're written semi-contradictory, like you see this in the medical space a lot, when you're writing about kidney function and dialysis and kidney disease, you've used three different terms and you have three different policies at different levels, but they're using different terms, so they actually don't even know that they're contradictory. And I heard that, at places like CMS and the VA, where
mhm,
they have a lot of policies out there, but they actually don't, that down to the, at the doctor level, but it's
mhm,
really confusing for doctors, because then they're reading, 15 different policies with 15 different, four
mhm,
different sets of keywords that are actually written about the same thing, but they don't realize, like the people that are writing them don't realize that they're
mhm,
writing contradictory policies across the board. So I think you're going to see it happen there. Really anything that needs any kind of content, like particularly like media relations, I think you're going to see it there. I think you're probably going to see things like a lot of chat bots with like the IRS. Like, can you
mhm.
imagine applying this to tax code where you could just ask your tax code questions?
That'd be amazing. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
that'd be great.
Um,
Um,
yeah,
I
yeah,
also don't I don't know, I think have you ever really used chatbots? Like, I don't know, maybe it's younger folks that are into it, but I'm
Yeah,
not gonna
yeah.
lie to you. I view those as just
They're
like
so
another step
frustrating.
to talk to
Yeah,
somebody.
yeah,
Right? So, like,
yeah,
I'm here for it. I think that, like, I think that's absolutely a use case that's gonna happen a lot. My question really is, I mean, is that like the best tool for the job?
yeah,
Understanding users, and because I always think about things from a non-technical perspective. Is like, yeah, chatbots are cool, but
yeah.
is that actually effective from a user, when you're trying to solve user
Yeah.
problems, right?
It depends. It depends. Honestly, it depends on how you apply it. So, like as an example, we built what we call a cognitive neural entity because you can chat with it, but it has inline short-term memory and
Sure.
it has some long-term memory.
Mhm,
For the specific user. And we built it around this association called they're called APMP, the Association of Proposal Management
mhm,
Professionals, on their website for their members.
mhm,
Um, but they're able to interact with the body, all of the APMP body of knowledge for best practices for proposals
mhm.
uh, at that level and chat with it the way that they would a human being. And it talks to them the way that we would a human being. It's much more effective than a normal, quote
Right.
unquote chatbot. So it truly depends on how you build it. Again,
Mhm.
domain specific is a
Right.
huge benefit across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I think that I'm also just like being a stodgy old man when I say those things, right? Like I don't,
Oh no, I've had some bad chatbot
right.
experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, and that's always my thing is that like oftentimes I think like the simplest solution is the best one. I think it
Yeah.
always is. And if you can have domain specific, very domain specific chatbots, I think that could absolutely help. But I mean, like the taxes is a great one. I think that
Yeah.
like, and when you start thinking about like I think that's a huge area of opportunity because there's a huge, and we always hear about it, is a huge shortage of accountants out there, or
Oh,
like
for sure.
CPAs,
Yeah.
right? And so, and it's a not, I mean, it's not super low risk, but it's not super high risk either. And um, when you start applying new tax code, right?
Yeah.
So I'm actually listening to this book that somebody recommended to me called Range, and it's all about and you actually you might like it. It's why generalists thrive in a specialist world, right?
Oh,
So
interesting.
it's all about how essentially like people with diverse backgrounds are able to bring different unique points of view to problems.
Oh yeah.
And so like as part of this book, and I was just listening to this yesterday, like there's a chapter where they're talking, a guy went around and he was in all of the best is it like the top 150 or 200 science like research laboratories, right?
Yeah.
And he was trying to figure out, like, the creme de la creme. He was trying to figure out why some were more productive than others. And
Yeah.
interestingly, the most productive labs consistently were the ones with that did the most diverse research, right?
Oh,
So when you
interesting.
had all a bunch of experts that only thought about, say, physics or nuclear physics or whatever, and like
Yeah.
and that's the only thing that they were thinking about and talking about, and all of them did the same thing. They were less productive than folks
Yeah.
that had diverse backgrounds, because when you're in those meetings and you're talking and like talking about problems, they're bringing different perspectives, and like
Yeah.
allegories are how we are a great way of like scientific discovery and thought, where and to I think the what you were saying earlier around things that AI is bad at, like coming up with new ideas. It's because it can't apply seemingly unrelated solutions to new problems, right? That's something that we as humans are phenomenal at. And when you
Yeah.
start looking at how do you actually go about coming up with something new and like discovering something new, a lot of that has to do with, well, this is a similar problem. How does this work? And just logically thinking through a process.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I
Mhm,
think that that's why one of the reasons why generative AI itself is so exciting because it is, artificial intelligence before used to be reserved for, researchers and
mhm,
technologists and data scientists.
mhm,
But now, people are building models on their laptops.
mhm.
Like it is this is it really has democratized artificial intelligence itself. People are coming up with art and, song music and it is producing some new content, but to your point, it's not that necessarily like higher order of
Mhm.
content that's like, the world changing, problem
Right.
solutions to problems.
Mhm.
But it is really exposing more people to its utility and
Mhm.
to its actual use and function. Like it's no longer just the technologists, like the CTOs
Mhm.
or the data, like I said, the data scientists that are and researchers that are using it. Like we all have to get used to this technology,
Mhm.
all the way from the researcher, to the CEO of a healthcare company. Like
Right.
we're all need to know how this technology works so that one, we can utilize it, like you were saying, in the most suitable and responsible ways,
Mhm.
and we need to understand its limitations
Yeah.
and where how we can help fill the gaps in those
Mhm.
limitations. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I think, you touched on, responsible way, right? And I mean, I believe that AI is gonna change the world fundamentally over the next decade,
Yeah.
similarly to how social media did previously, and the smartphone and
Yeah.
like the internet, right? Is
Yeah.
truthfully like that's kind of where we are. And I think things are just starting to go parabolic because people are
Yeah.
just starting to understand, right?
Yeah.
And, when I think about like, and I mean, I talk about this a lot, but like all you have to do to understand what happens if you don't do it responsibly is look at social media, the ubiquity of social media, the ubiquity of the smartphone in 2010,
Absolutely.
like starting right 2009, 2010, and that and the rise of, anxiety, depression, ADHD, mental health disorders, and suicides in children, right? And
Yeah.
teenagers, and
Yeah.
understand like what can happen if it goes wrong, right?
Yeah.
And like I think social media has done a lot for the world in a lot of ways,
Oh,
some of it
sure.
good, but I think that like I don't think it's all good, right?
Yeah.
And, if we'd thought, and I actually just heard on the news this morning that I think it's somewhere out in California, they just banned cell phones in all schools,
It's probably
starting
a good choice.
and it's a great choice, right?
Yeah.
Like, but we didn't like, it took us 15 years to figure that out.
Right.
That,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's just like, no, that's a terrible idea. We shouldn't do that, right? And like, unfortunately, I think that, there's a lot of potential for downside with AI,
Yeah.
but I think that if we can build it out and do it in a responsible, forward-thinking way and learn from our past mistakes, I think that it can absolutely be a massive impact for good in the world.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree with you. And I think it's also incumbent on us as individuals, that I'm happy to see that there are policies coming out
Mhm,
sooner than I would have anticipated in the US around
mhm,
generative AI. And they are continuing to come out. Like I think NIST 600 is coming out later. It
mhm,
should come out later this year, hopefully.
mhm,
But there are more guidelines and policies being put in place by corporations and the government around generative AI, how it should be used, how it should be built,
mhm,
the type of information that needs to be disclosed about how it's being built and used. That's all really important. And then it's incumbent on us as well, uh, as individuals, to
mhm,
understand how this technology can also be used for things like misinformation and things like how to it can be pretty hard to spot
mhm,
sometimes, the use of generative AI, but it's still really new. So like right now, easier to spot, way easier to spot. But I think that it's going to be incumbent on us to educate ourselves, particularly the marriage of social media and generative AI for misinformation. It is going to be huge
mhm,
for us to
100%.
really make sure that we're protecting ourselves and what we're consuming.
I completely agree. Yeah, is anything, before we wrap up, anything else you'd like to say? Any other points that I missed
No,
or
I really appreciate you having me on. This is a good conversation. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun and looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick.
Bye.